Imagine this. You set out on a grand adventure into the wilderness of Nahanni National Park. Everything is going good until night falls. You begin hearing strange noises and they begin to approach your tent. And the next thing you know, you're thrust out of your tent and wham! Off goes your head, decapitated. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason it is named the Headless Valley. Kind of. For instance, a girl named May Lafferty vanished in what would become one of the area's most unsettling incidents. Now, May had arrived in the Nahanni Valley during the summer of 1921 with her cousin, Mary Field, and her husband, Poole Field. Everybody always regarded May as peculiar. Now, one acquaintance even described her as neurotic. But this only heightened on her trip to Nahanni, where she felt deeply homesick, longing for her home of Fort Simpson. Now, on their 1921 trip, the Fields and May were accompanied by a seasoned party of indigenous guides. The plan was to exchange furs at local trading posts for a variety of goods, including ammunition and food. One day, however, May simply vanished. At first, everyone suspected that she had simply left to use the bathroom, but when she failed to return later in the day, everyone grew deeply concerned. Mary Field asked her husband to lead the effort to find the girl, and Poole Field wasted no time. He set off into the wilderness with 5 indigenous hunters, all of whom knew the area and bushcraft exceedingly well. They quickly found May's trail in the woods, and from what they could tell, the girl had simply gotten turned around and wandered off in the wrong direction. Now, Poole Field was no stranger to the outdoors, but even he found it difficult to keep up with the pace of his guides. They noticed something odd. May's footprints seemed to indicate that she had moved with a speed and dexterity rivaling their own. Somehow, this girl had moved through the forest better than the best tracker. May Lafferty also traveled incredibly far. For 9 days, Poole and the hunters tracked May's footprints, and from time to time they would discover bits of her tattered clothing draped on the branches. They found so much, in fact, that it seemed as if she had deliberately shed her clothing. Now, this was beyond comprehension for a number of reasons, not the least of which the inundation of mosquitoes that the Nahanni Valley suffers in the summer months. It simply defied all logic. At last, their journey reached an end, according to the book Nahanni by Dick Turner. By now, she had got into rugged country where she had to do some very steep climbing. She must have been without fear, for she climbed some cliffs where the men were afraid to go and had to go away around and pick up her track on top. The hunters came to the bottom of a very rugged high cliff, which was actually the side of a 5,000-foot mountain. Her tracks were visible at the bottom, but they could find no sign that she had turned to the left or the right. And Poole said there was just no way that any sane person could have possibly gone up that wall of the rock. There was an indication that she might have tried, for there was a narrow shelf-like ledge up for 100 feet or so. Some of them went part way up but turned back. And Poole thought for sure they had come to the end of the trail, but they worked their way round to the top, and sure enough, there was her track again, heading south and east. Sane or not, she was heading in the direction of her home, which was Simpson. The search party was called off only a few days later. May Lafferty was abandoned for dead, although to this day, her remains have never really been recovered. Now, Nahanni Valley claimed another victim around the same time. In the early 1920s, fur trapper and World War I veteran John O'Brien set off into the Nahanni Valley, hoping to find some peace and solitude, and perhaps wealth. In this isolated local, along the banks of the Jackfish River, he built a simple cabin sharing a trap line with another man whose name has been lost to the mists of time. Now, at any rate, John found some degree of success until 1922. On January 27th, he departed his home to check some traps that he had set in the days prior. So John told his partner that he would be out in the wilderness for somewhere between 8 to 10 days in total. According to some versions of the tale, he did not return for 2 weeks, at which point his partner set out to search for him. Other renditions have his partner playing the part of the villain, accompanying joining him on the trip only to abandon him. What we do know is that John was missing for around a month before two others, Jack LaFair and Jonas Lafferty, went out to find him. Word of John's disappearance had reached their cabin at the Clawson Creek Hot Springs, and they set off on their search for the missing comrade. Jack and Jonas scoured the countryside for any sign of John. They eventually discovered his body high on the lonesome peak at the end of his trapline. He appeared frozen, though why he let his situation become so dire is anyone's guess. From what they could tell, it appeared as if John had been trying to light a fire at the time he succumbed to the frigid Canadian winter. In his hand, he held a large box of matches. Now, John O'Brien was buried where they found him. From that day forward, that site has been known as O'Brien's Mountain. One of the more famous deaths from the early 20th century contributed to the Nahanni reputation as the Headless Valley. The victim, known only as Yukon Fisher, was a giant of a man with a reputation for winning every fight he participated in. After an especially violent brawl, Fisher fled to the Nahanni wilderness where he lived as an outlaw. Fisher lived nomadically, leaving behind a string of crude bush shelters wherever he went. Ever the loner, his only contact with the outside world was when he dropped in on the nearest trading post to exchange bits of gold for supplies. On one occasion, an Indian tracker came to inform Fisher that he was no longer hunted by the law. The person he assaulted in the bar all those years earlier had dropped all charges. Fisher, now a fully feral wild man, refused to believe the good news and chose to remain in the wilderness. Yukon Fisher wasn't heard from again, but in 1928, an expedition in Nahanni found a headless skeleton of a giant white man. Alongside his corpse were a bent carbine rifle and the remnants of a primitive shelter, similar to the kind that Yukon Fisher was famous for building. It looked as though the scene had remained the same for the past 15 years. Although it was impossible to determine the identity of the body, many believed that these were the remains of Yukon Fisher. Now, exactly how he died and where his head went and why his rifle was bent are still unknown. Tragedy and mystery continued to loom over the valley well into the 20th century, because in 1946, a Frank Henderson stumbled back to civilization after spending time in the Nahanni wilderness, and he carried with him 30 ounces of gold and a horrifying tale. Now, that autumn prior, Frank and his partner, John Patterson, had planned to go out panning for gold. John was an experienced outdoorsman in relatively good health and had weathered all that life in the wilderness could throw at him. However, John never arrived at the meeting place to begin their expedition that summer. Frank was bewildered. John had left with 3 guides and 6 months' worth of provisions, but was never heard from again. When they learned of his absence, Frank's own guides abandoned him, convinced that his partner had succumbed to the diabolical forces long believed to haunt the Nahanni Valley. Frank ended up spending that summer and fall panning for gold all by himself. He would never give up his search for John, even going so far as to charter an airplane to search from above, but he never found any trace of his partner. Later, he remembered that lonely season working in the valley alone, and he said, "All summer I moved with utmost caution, mostly at night. There is absolutely no denying the sinister atmosphere of that whole valley. The weird continual wailing of the wind is something I won't soon forget." There have been plenty of other disappearances and deaths since then. Like in 1957, 18-year-old prospector Leonard Bruchnick was discovered dead in Nahanni, face down in his own vomit, the remains of a crude raft in the river nearby. Now, the cause of death remains a mystery, but the vomit may provide an important clue. In fact, modern-day rumors claim they found an empty cardboard pizza box from Sabaro alongside his remains, suggesting death from acute food poisoning or, at the very least, an intense sense of shame. Bush pilot Angus Mackenzie flew into Nahanni to ferry supplies to a filming location in the fall of 1962, only to never return. 6 months later, the wreckage of this plane was discovered with 100 days worth of supplies and a diary detailing 46 days in the wilderness, but his body was never found. A year later, 3 Swiss men canoed down the South Nahanni River, with the exception of one body found the following month, trapped beneath the rapids. None of them were ever seen again either. Now today, Nahanni National Park Reserve remains one of the least visited parks. It is highly inaccessible, reached only by water or air, meaning that it sees only around 1,000 visitors each year, give or take. In some ways, this is a tragedy. The park is undeniably beautiful. In other ways, it may be for the best. If there were more visitors, who knows how many more might actually fall victim to the dark forces of the Headless Valley. While famous for its jaw-dropping waterfalls, majestic canyons, and roaring whitewater rapids, its 12,000 square miles enjoys a more sinister reputation. The Nahanni Valley has long been regarded as one of the most mysterious places on all of Earth. I mean, for hundreds of years, if not millennia, people have held that something beyond human understanding snakes through its forests and prowls its canyons. There are stories of tall, hairy giants waiting to abduct the unwary in the forest. There are tales of prehistoric creatures, from dinosaurs to dire wolves, on the hunt for their next meal. Perhaps worst of all, there are rumors of malevolent spiritual forces. Now, Nahanni National Park Reserve has a reputation for inexplicable disappearances and deaths. Some bodies are found lacking their heads, while others are found intact, but their cause of death ultimately remains unclear. Still, others vanish without a trace. And the most important question, will you be one of them? And more importantly, I want to know what you guys think, so be sure to go ahead and drop a comment down below, because I would love to read it and know your guys' thoughts and opinions. And if you guys enjoyed today's episode, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like today's. And as always, guys, remember, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.